November 14, 1943. The rain hammered the northern French countryside like machine gun fire against metal, turning the muddy roads into rivers of cold sludge. Beneath a crumbling stone bridge outside the occupied town of Abbeville, a man crouched in absolute silence. His name was Captain William Fairfax, a 34-year-old Royal Engineer from Birmingham, and in his trembling hands, he held enough plastic explosive to turn the German supply convoy, scheduled to pass overhead in exactly 7 minutes, into a burning graveyard of twisted steel and shattered ambition. But this wasn't just about one bridge. This wasn't just about one convoy. This was about something far bigger. Something that would shake the very foundations of Nazi logistics across occupied France. Something that British High Command had deemed so dangerous, so audacious, and so unlikely to succeed that they'd given Fairfax and his team a code name that felt more like a eulogy than an operation title, Operation Severed Vein. The mission? Destroy 9 critical German supply lines in just 14 days. 9 arteries pumping fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements to Wehrmacht divisions preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion. 9 targets spread across 200 miles of enemy-occupied territory, each one guarded, each one watched, each one a potential death trap. And Fairfax was going to hit them all. The wind carried the distant rumble of diesel engines. German voices echoed somewhere above, distorted by rain and concrete. Fairfax pressed himself deeper into the shadows beneath the bridge, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing November air. His uniform was soaked through, clinging to his skin like ice water. Beside him, Sergeant Thomas McKee, a Glasgow-born demolitions expert with hands scarred from 1,000 controlled detonations, methodically attached detonator wires to the charges they'd spent 3 hours planting along the bridge's support columns. "They're early," McKee whispered, his Scottish accent barely audible over the rain. "Convoy's 2 minutes ahead of schedule." Fairfax felt his heart slam against his ribcage. 2 minutes. In the world of sabotage and explosives, 2 minutes was the difference between a successful mission and a shallow grave in a foreign field. The timing had to be perfect. Detonate too early, and the explosion would alert every German patrol within 5 miles before the convoy arrived. Too late, and the trucks would pass safely overhead, carrying their deadly cargo toward the Atlantic wall defenses that would slaughter thousands of Allied soldiers during the coming invasion. The sound of engines grew louder. Closer. The entire bridge began to vibrate with the weight of approaching vehicles. Fairfax closed his eyes for just a moment, and in that darkness, he saw the faces of the men who'd gotten him here. Lieutenant David Pearson, killed 3 days ago by a German sniper in Rouen. Corporal James Fletcher, captured during the reconnaissance mission in Beauvais, now likely being tortured in a Gestapo cell. Private Michael Stevens, who'd stepped on a landmine during their approach to target number 3, his screams still echoing in Fairfax's nightmares. 4 targets down. 5 targets remaining. 5 more chances to die. But also 5 more chances to starve the German war machine. 5 more chances to save Allied lives when the invasion came. 5 more chances to prove that one engineer with a brilliant plan and a handful of brave men could accomplish what an entire bomber squadron couldn't. The first truck appeared overhead. Then the second. Then the third. Fairfax could hear the creak of the bridge's wooden planks, the splash of tires through puddles, the sharp German commands shouting for the convoy to maintain speed and spacing. Through the gaps in the stone and timber, he caught glimpses of the vehicles, Opel Blitz trucks loaded with artillery shells, fuel tankers marked with the distinctive Wehrmacht cross, armored cars with mounted machine guns. This convoy was carrying enough ammunition to supply an entire panzer division for a week. In 90 seconds, it would cease to exist. McKee looked at Fairfax, his finger hovering over the detonator switch. The sergeant's eyes asked the question his voice couldn't risk: "Are you ready for this?" Fairfax had been asking himself the same question since that rainy afternoon 2 months ago when he'd first walked into the Special Operations Executive Headquarters in London. He'd been summoned without explanation, pulled from his regular duties with the Royal Engineers, and ushered into a basement room where 3 stern-faced intelligence officers sat behind a table covered in maps, photographs, and classified documents stamped with red ink. "Captain Fairfax," the senior officer had said, sliding a photograph across the table. "What do you see?" The photograph showed a railway bridge in France, crowded with German supply trains. "I see a target," Fairfax had replied. "We see 9 targets," the officer corrected. 9 critical supply lines that the Germans are using to reinforce the Atlantic Wall. Railways, bridges, fuel depots, ammunition dumps. Hit them all, and you cut off one of the Wehrmacht's primary logistics networks in northern France. You create chaos. You force them to reroute supplies hundreds of miles out of their way. You buy the invasion forces time and breathing room. Another officer had leaned forward. The problem is scale and speed. Traditional bombing raids are too imprecise and too loud. The Germans will simply rebuild or adapt within days. We need surgical strikes. Simultaneous chaos. A campaign of sabotage so rapid and devastating that the enemy doesn't have time to respond before the next target explodes. 2 weeks, the third officer had added. 9 targets. Behind enemy lines. The entire operation will be deniable, unsupported, and highly lethal. Casualty projections for your team are. He'd paused, choosing his words carefully. Unfavorable. Fairfax had stared at the maps, his engineering mind already calculating blast radii, structural weak points, approach routes, and escape vectors. It was insane. Suicide, really. The kind of mission that would be remembered as either a stroke of strategic genius or a catastrophic waste of British lives. When do I leave? Fairfax had asked. Now, crouched beneath this bridge with German trucks rumbling overhead and death waiting in every direction, Fairfax understood the full weight of that decision. This wasn't about medals or glory. This wasn't about personal heroism or battlefield bravery. This was about cold, calculated violence delivered with an engineer's precision and a saboteur's ruthlessness. This was about making the Germans bleed from 1,000 cuts they never saw coming. The last truck in the convoy rolled onto the bridge. Mackay's hand tightened on the detonator, knuckles white with tension. Rain continued to pour down in sheets, turning the world into a gray, miserable blur. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, strange and haunting, a reminder that normal life once existed in these occupied towns, before the Wehrmacht marched in with their tanks and their flags and their brutal occupation policies. Fairfax raised his hand, counting down silently. 5, 4, 3. A German soldier appeared at the edge of the bridge, peering down into the darkness where Fairfax and Mackay hid. Had they been spotted? Was it over? Fairfax's other hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his belt, though he knew that shooting would only alert the entire convoy and doom them both. The soldier lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the rain. He was young, maybe 19, maybe younger. Just a kid in a Wehrmacht uniform, probably conscripted from some farm in Bavaria or Prussia, now standing guard over a convoy that was about to become a fireball. 2. 1. Fairfax dropped his hand. Mackay pressed the detonator. For a split second, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then the charges detonated with a sound like the earth itself splitting open, a massive, concussive boom that shattered the rain-soaked air and sent a shockwave rippling across the countryside. The bridge's support columns exploded in synchronized eruptions of concrete dust and steel fragments. The roadway buckled, twisted, and collapsed inward with a horrifying groan of structural failure. The German trucks, all 8 of them, plunged into the void. The explosion painted the night sky orange and red, flames erupting from the twisted wreckage as fuel tanks ruptured and ammunition cooked off in secondary blasts that echoed like thunder across the French countryside. Fairfax and Mackay were already running, sprinting away from the collapsing bridge as chunks of concrete and burning debris rained down around them like apocalyptic hail. Go, go, Go! Fairfax shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Behind them, German voices screamed in confusion and rage. Whistles blew. Somewhere, an alarm bell began to clang frantically. The occupation forces were mobilizing, but in the darkness and confusion, they had no idea where the saboteurs had gone. By the time Wehrmacht patrols arrived at the bridge site, Fairfax and Mackay would be 2 miles away, already planning their next target. Target number 5, accomplished. 4 remaining. They reached the rendezvous point, an abandoned farmhouse 20 minutes later, their lungs burning from the sprint. Inside, Lieutenant Sarah Covington waited with a radio set and a map spread across a broken table. She was 27, a wireless operator recruited from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and one of the only people in occupied France who knew the full scope of Operation Severed Vein. Her job was to coordinate movements, decode messages from London, and provide the intelligence updates that kept Fairfax's team one step ahead of German security forces. Clean hit? She asked as they burst through the door. Perfect, Mackay panted, collapsing against the wall. Bridge is gone. Convoy is gone. Half the Wehrmacht is probably swarming the area right now. Covington nodded, already packing up the radio equipment. Then we need to move. German wireless intercepts show increased patrol activity across the entire region. They know someone's hitting their supply lines. They just don't know who, how many, or where you'll strike next. Fairfax pulled out his waterproof notebook, a battered, mud-stained thing filled with sketches, calculations, and target profiles. He flipped to the next page, where he'd drawn a detailed schematic of target number 6, a railway junction outside Amiens that serviced 3 different supply routes into Belgium and the Netherlands. "This one's different," Fairfax said, his finger tracing the railway lines on the map. "The junction handles 50 trains per day. Military supplies, civilian goods, troop transports. The Germans have it fortified like a military installation, watchtowers, patrols, guard dogs, the whole lot. We can't approach it the same way we hit the bridge." McKee leaned over the map, his experienced eyes scanning the terrain and defenses. "What are you thinking?" Fairfax smiled, a cold, calculating expression that had nothing to do with humor. "I'm thinking we don't blow the tracks. We blow the switching station. The control hub that manages all the train movements. Take that out, and the entire junction becomes useless. Trains will back up for miles. Supplies will sit in rail cars, rotting. The Germans will need weeks to rebuild the switching mechanisms. And how do we get inside a fortified railway control station?" Covington asked. "We don't," Fairfax replied. "We get the Germans to let us in." The plan was brilliant in its audacity and terrifying in its risk. Fairfax had acquired German railway worker uniforms from a French resistance contact in Abbeville, stolen from a laundry facility 2 weeks earlier. He and McKee would pose as replacement technicians, sent to perform routine maintenance on the switching equipment. They'd walk through the front gate, plant their explosives inside the control station, set a delayed fuse, and walk back out before anyone realized what had happened. "That's insane," McKee said flatly. "That's why it'll work," Fairfax countered. "The Germans are expecting saboteurs to attack from the outside, stealth infiltrations, nighttime raids, armed assaults. They're not expecting 2 engineers to knock on the front door with work orders and toolboxes full of explosives." Covington shook her head, but she was already pulling forged documents from her supply pack. The Special Operations Executive had provided her with blank German forms, official stamps, and enough bureaucratic paperwork to fool even the most suspicious Wehrmacht officer. "I can forge the work orders," she said. "But if anyone checks with regional command—" "They won't have time," Fairfax interrupted. "We hit the junction tomorrow afternoon during shift change. Maximum confusion, minimum scrutiny. In and out in 30 minutes. 22 hours later, Fairfax and McKee stood at the gates of the Amiens railway junction, dressed in grease-stained German worker uniforms and carrying heavy toolboxes packed with enough plastic explosive to level a city block. The forged work orders were tucked into Fairfax's jacket pocket, the paper crisp and official-looking. His heart hammered against his ribs as a Wehrmacht guard approached, rifle slung over his shoulder. "Papers," the guard demanded in German. Fairfax handed over the documents, keeping his expression neutral and bored, just another railway worker arriving for another tedious day of maintenance work. The guard examined the papers with agonizing slowness, his eyes flicking between the documents and Fairfax's face. Seconds stretched into eternities. Behind them, a locomotive whistled, and the sound felt like a death knell. The guard handed back the papers. "Switching station is Building 3. Report to Supervisor Kessler." They were in. The interior of the railway junction was a maze of tracks, platforms, and industrial buildings belching steam and coal smoke into the gray afternoon sky. German soldiers were everywhere, patrolling the platforms, guarding supply trains, checking identification papers. Fairfax and McKee walked with purpose, their toolboxes heavy in their hands, their minds racing through the mission parameters. Find the control room. Plant the charges on the main switching panel and the backup generator. Set the timer for 2 hours, enough time to escape the junction and establish an alibi, but not so long that the explosives might be discovered during a routine inspection. Building 3 was a squat concrete structure at the center of the junction, its windows barred and its entrance guarded by 2 more soldiers. Fairfax showed his papers again, and again they were waved through. Inside, the control room was a cathedral of switches, levers, signal boards, and electrical panels, the nervous system of the entire railway network. A dozen German technicians worked at various stations, managing train schedules and track assignments. Supervisor Kessler, a thin, nervous man in his 50s, barely looked up from his clipboard. "You're late," he snapped. "Panel 7 has been malfunctioning all morning. Fix it." Fairfax nodded and moved toward Panel 7 with McKee close behind. They opened their toolboxes, and beneath the wrenches and screwdrivers, the plastic explosives waited like coiled serpents. Working with agonizing slowness, they began the process of hiding the charges behind access panels and inside electrical housings, anywhere the explosives wouldn't be immediately visible. Minutes crawled by like hours. Every sound felt amplified, the click of switches, the shuffle of boots, the rustle of paper. Fairfax's hands moved with mechanical precision, his engineering training allowing him to work even while his mind screamed warnings of danger. One mistake. One moment of suspicion. One technician asking the wrong question, and they'd be arrested, tortured, executed. McKee finished first, his charges hidden inside the backup generator housing. He caught Fairfax's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Fairfax set the timer on his detonator, 2 hours, starting now, and closed the access panel. Panel 7 is operational, Fairfax announced to Kessler. The supervisor waved them away dismissively. Fine. Leave your report with the gate guard. They walked out of the control room, through the junction, past the patrols and the supply trains and the guard posts. Every step felt like walking across a minefield. The gate appeared ahead, freedom just yards away. The same guard who checked their papers on arrival nodded them through without a second glance. They were clear. 2 hours later, from a hilltop 3 miles away, they watched the railway junction explode. The explosion at the Amiens Junction created a fireball visible for 10 miles, a mushroom cloud of black smoke and orange flame that rose into the evening sky like a monument to destruction. The blast shattered windows in nearby buildings, derailed 3 supply trains that happened to be passing through the junction at that moment, and severed the primary railway connection between northern France and the German industrial heartland. But more importantly, it sent shockwaves through Wehrmacht High Command. Suddenly, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't random partisan activity or opportunistic sabotage by local resistance cells. This was a coordinated campaign, precise, relentless, and devastatingly effective. Someone with military engineering expertise and intimate knowledge of German logistics was systematically destroying their supply infrastructure. The Germans called it Geisternetz, the ghost network. An invisible enemy that struck without warning and vanished without a trace. In Berlin, Generaloberst Heinrich von Stolpnagel, the military governor of occupied France, convened an emergency meeting of security chiefs. 6 targets destroyed in 10 days, he raged, slamming his fist on the conference table. Bridges, railways, fuel depots, all critical supply nodes. The 7th Army reports ammunition shortages. The 15th Army reports fuel shortages. Our defensive preparations for the anticipated invasion are being systematically undermined by saboteurs we cannot find. Oberst Ernst Hoffmann, chief of Wehrmacht counterintelligence in northern France, studied the map where red pins marked each sabotage site. The attack pattern suggests a single team, he said carefully. Possibly British commandos or SOE operatives. They're moving rapidly, never hitting the same area twice, always staying ahead of our security sweeps. Then predict their next target, von Stolpnagel demanded. Use the pattern. Deploy troops. Set a trap. Hoffmann's finger traced a circle on the map around the city of Calais. The next logical target would be here, the coastal fuel depot at Sangatte. It supplies every Wehrmacht unit defending the Pas de Calais. If the saboteurs follow their established pattern of targeting maximum impact logistics sites, Sangatte is the obvious choice. Triple the guards, von Stolpnagel ordered. Patrols every hour. Inform the Gestapo. I want these terrorists captured alive so we can extract information about their network before we execute them. But Captain William Fairfax had no intention of hitting the Sangatte fuel depot. That's what he wanted the Germans to think. 3 miles from the abandoned farmhouse where Fairfax's team now operated, Lieutenant Sarah Covington hunched over her radio set, carefully transmitting deliberately sloppy-coded messages that British intelligence knew the Germans could intercept and partially decode. The messages referenced coastal operations, fuel resources, and northern preparations, just enough information to point German counterintelligence towards Sangatte while Fairfax's actual target lay in the opposite direction. Are we sure this misdirection will work? McKee asked, cleaning his rifle by candlelight. Fairfax spread out his maps, now worn and creased from constant use. The Germans are brilliant tacticians but predictable strategists. They'll analyze the pattern, predict our next move, and deploy forces accordingly. By feeding them false intelligence through Sarah's radio intercepts, we ensure they're looking in the wrong place while we hit the real target. And the real target is? Covington asked. Fairfax's finger landed on a location 20 miles south of their current position. The Beauvais ammunition dump. It's a massive underground storage facility built into old mining tunnels. The Germans keep it stocked with artillery shells, small arms ammunition, grenades, and demolition charges for their Atlantic Wall construction projects. Estimates suggest there's enough explosive material stored there to sustain combat operations for an entire army group. McKay let out a low whistle. That's not a sabotage target. That's a military installation. It'll be heavily guarded. Which is why they won't expect us to hit it, Fairfax replied. The previous targets were accessible, relatively lightly defended, easy to approach and escape. The ammunition dump is the opposite, a hardened target that conventional military wisdom says should require a battalion-sized force to assault. The Germans will assume would never attempt it. Maybe the Germans are right, Covington said quietly. Maybe we shouldn't attempt it. You've hit 6 targets. That's already beyond what command expected. You could extract now, mission accomplished, and save the remaining targets for follow-up operations. Fairfax shook his head. Every day we delay is another day the Germans use these supply lines to strengthen their defenses. When the invasion comes, and it's coming soon, everyone knows it, our boys will be storming beaches against Wehrmacht divisions armed and supplied through the very networks we're trying to destroy. We hit the remaining targets. All of them. Even the impossible ones. But Fairfax knew the mathematics of attrition were catching up with them. His team had started with 8 men. Now only 2 remained operational, himself and McKay. Covington was invaluable for intelligence and communications, but she wasn't trained for direct action. Meanwhile, German security forces were flooding the region, checkpoints multiplying like cancer cells, patrols growing more aggressive and suspicious. The window for Operation Severed Vein was closing. The approach to the Beauvais ammunition dump required 3 days of careful reconnaissance. Fairfax and McKay observed the facility from hidden positions, noting guard rotations, patrol patterns, entry procedures, and security vulnerabilities. The Germans had transformed the old mining complex into a fortress, reinforced gates, machine gun nests, searchlights, guard dogs, and regular perimeter sweeps by heavily armed soldiers. But Fairfax noticed something. The ammunition dump received supply deliveries every Tuesday and Thursday, trucks bringing additional munitions from railway depots and distribution centers. The delivery trucks were inspected at the main gate, but once cleared, they drove directly into the underground storage tunnels to unload. We don't assault the installation, Fairfax explained to McKay. We hitch a ride. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They would hijack one of the supply trucks during its delivery route, dispose of the German drivers, and drive the truck straight into the ammunition dump disguised as a routine delivery. Once inside the underground tunnels, they'd plant their explosives throughout the storage areas and detonate the entire facility from within. And how do we escape before the explosion? McKay asked. Fairfax hesitated. That's the part I'm still working on. On Thursday morning, November 25, 1943, they executed the plan. A Wehrmacht supply truck left the Beauvais railway depot at 0800 hours, carrying crates of artillery shells toward the ammunition dump. 5 miles down the road, Fairfax and McKay stepped from the tree line wearing stolen German uniforms and waving the truck to stop, pretending to be military police conducting a security inspection. The moment the truck halted, McKay shot both drivers, quick, efficient, silenced pistol shots that echoed like whispers in the empty countryside. They dragged the bodies into the forest, climbed into the truck's cab, and continued driving toward the ammunition dump as if nothing had happened. The gate guards waved them through after a cursory inspection of their forged paperwork. The truck rolled into the underground tunnels, descending into a subterranean world of concrete walls, electric lights, and stacked munitions. Hundreds of tons of explosives surrounded them on all sides, enough destructive power to level half of Beauvais. Fairfax and McKay worked with desperate speed, hiding plastic explosive charges among the ammunition crates, setting timers, connecting detonators. The guards outside grew suspicious when the unloading took longer than usual. Voices called down the tunnel, "Is there a problem?" "Just finishing up." Fairfax called back in German, his accent passable enough to avoid immediate suspicion. 10 minutes. That's how long they had before someone came to investigate. They finished planting the last charge. McKay set the timer, 15 minutes. They climbed back into the truck and drove toward the exit, their hearts pounding, their hands steady through sheer force of will. The gate. Freedom. Survival. An alarm began to wail. The siren cut through the morning air like a blade, its mechanical shriek bouncing off the concrete walls of the underground tunnels and echoing into the gray November sky. Fairfax's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the truck accelerated toward the gate, diesel engine roaring. Beside him, McKay gripped his rifle, eyes locked on the Wehrmacht guards who were suddenly scrambling into defensive positions, weapons raised, confused shouts overlapping. "They know," McKay growled. "Somebody found the bodies or checked the truck manifest or—" "Doesn't matter," Fairfax interrupted, pressing the accelerator to the floor. "We're not stopping." The gate was closing. 2 guards ran to intercept them, waving frantically for the truck to halt. A machine gunner swung his .42 toward them, the barrel tracking their movement. Behind them, deep in the underground storage tunnels, the timer on their explosives counted down, 13 minutes, 40 seconds. Fairfax didn't slow down. The truck crashed through the partially closed gate in an explosion of splintering wood and twisted metal. Bullets sparked off the truck's chassis and shattered the side mirrors. The windscreen spiderwebbed with cracks as a rifle round punched through the glass inches from Fairfax's head. He kept driving, swerving wildly as the truck emerged from the compound and fishtailed onto the main road. Behind them, whistles blew and engines roared to life. A German patrol car burst from a side building, its occupants shouting into radio handsets. Another vehicle, an armored Kübelwagen with a mounted machine gun, raced after them, the gunner opening fire with a sustained burst that tore chunks from the truck's rear cargo area. "They're going to shred us before we get clear of the blast radius," McKay shouted, returning fire through the truck's rear window. His shots were precise despite the violent bouncing of the vehicle, 2 rounds through the patrol car's windscreen, forcing it to swerve off the road. The Kübelwagen kept coming, machine gun chattering relentlessly. Fairfax's mind raced through calculations. The ammunition dump's location. The explosive payload they'd planted. The size of the blast. The minimum safe distance. They needed at least 2 miles of separation, preferably 3. They'd covered maybe half a mile. The truck's maximum speed was 50 miles per hour. The timer had maybe 12 minutes remaining. It was going to be close. "Sarah." McKay yelled into the portable radio they'd brought. "We're compromised. Extraction point Alpha is burned. Move to Bravo and get the hell out of the area." Covington's voice crackled back, calm despite the circumstances. "Confirmed. Bravo point in 20 minutes. Don't be late." "Working on it." Fairfax gritted out, yanking the steering wheel hard left as they reached a fork in the road. The truck's tires screamed in protest, but the maneuver put a row of buildings between them and the pursuing Kübelwagen, buying precious seconds. But more German vehicles were converging. Fairfax saw them in the distance, trucks full of Wehrmacht soldiers, motorcycle outriders, even a light armored car bristling with weapons. The entire occupation garrison was mobilizing. Even if Fairfax and McKay escaped immediate pursuit, there was nowhere to hide. Every road would be blocked. Every village would be searched. Every field would be swept by patrols. Unless the ammunition dump exploded and created enough chaos to cover their escape. Fairfax checked his watch, 8 minutes remaining. They'd covered maybe a mile and a half. Not enough. The blast wave alone could flip the truck, and the shrapnel and debris field would be lethal for at least another half-mile beyond that. "We need more distance," McKay said, echoing Fairfax's thoughts. "We're not going to make it." "Yes, we are," Fairfax replied, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Behind them, the Kübelwagen emerged from the buildings, machine guns still firing. Bullets stitched across the road, closing in on the fleeing truck. Then the road ahead ended. Not metaphorically, literally ended. The bridge they'd been racing toward was destroyed, its center span collapsed into the river below, supports dangling like broken teeth. A sign in German warned of the damage, but Fairfax had been too focused on escape to notice the D2 markers. McKay swore violently. "That's the bridge we blew on target 5. Fairfax slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a sideways halt 20 feet from the destroyed bridge. Behind them, the Kübelwagen was closing fast, less than 100 yards away now. To their left, open fields offered no cover. To their right, a dense forest climbed a hillside, rough terrain, but possible to navigate on foot. "Abandon vehicle," Fairfax ordered. "Into the forest. Now." They grabbed their weapons and remaining explosives and leaped from the truck's cab, sprinting toward the tree line as machine gun fire chewed up the ground around them. Fairfax felt the supersonic crack of bullets passing inches from his head, felt the air displacement, felt the pure animalistic terror of being hunted. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, but he kept running, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches. Behind them, German soldiers poured from their vehicles and gave chase on foot, their shouts echoing through the forest. Radio chatter crackled as they coordinated the manhunt. Fairfax and McKay scrambled up the hillside, using trees for cover, zigzagging to avoid presenting clean targets. A bullet clipped a tree trunk beside Fairfax's shoulder, spraying bark fragments across his face. 4 minutes on the timer. They reached a rocky outcropping halfway up the hill and took defensive positions behind the boulders. Mackay opened fire with controlled bursts, dropping 2 German soldiers and forcing the others to take cover. It bought them maybe 30 seconds. More Wehrmacht troops were circling through the forest, attempting to flank their position. "We're pinned," Mackay said flatly. "Even if we survive the blast, we can't outrun this many soldiers." Fairfax looked back toward the ammunition dump, still visible through the trees. The facility was a hive of activity, trucks and soldiers swarming everywhere, completely unaware that in less than 4 minutes, the entire complex was going to erupt like a volcano. And then Fairfax saw it. The answer. The insane, desperate, barely possible answer. "The blast wave," he said. "We use it." "What?" "The explosion is going to level everything within a mile radius," Fairfax explained rapidly. "But the shockwave will travel outward with enough force to knock down trees, collapse buildings, disorient everyone in the area. If we position ourselves just inside the safe radius but outside the lethal zone, right at the edge, the blast wave will create enough chaos to cover our escape. The Germans will be too busy dealing with casualties and damage to continue pursuing us." Mackay stared at him. "You want to deliberately stay close to a massive explosion." "Close enough to use it," Fairfax corrected. "Far enough to survive it." 2 minutes. They ran. Not away from the ammunition dump, but parallel to it, staying at approximately 2 miles distance while moving laterally around the facility's perimeter. German soldiers continued firing, but the terrain grew rougher, the forest denser. Fairfax counted seconds in his head, matching his movements to the mental countdown. 90 seconds. 80. 70. They reached a deep ravine cut by a stream. Fairfax pointed down. "There. Get below ground level. Cover your ears and open your mouth to equalize pressure." They slid down the muddy slope and pressed themselves into the deepest part of the ravine. German voices shouted nearby, "Close, too close." 30 seconds. 20. Fairfax opened his mouth, covered his ears, and waited for the world to end. The Beauvais ammunition dump exploded. The sound was indescribable, not a boom or a crash but a fundamental tearing of reality itself. The ground heaved like an ocean wave. Trees snapped like matchsticks. A wall of superheated air and debris roared overhead, and even protected in the ravine, Fairfax felt his entire body lifted and slammed back down by the shockwave. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all other sound. Dirt and rocks rained down in a deadly hail. Then, silence. Or not silence, just the absence of perception, his battered senses unable to process anything for several long seconds. When Fairfax's vision cleared, he looked up through the smoke and settling dust to see the forest transformed into a nightmare landscape. Trees were down everywhere, burning debris scattered across the hillside, and a mushroom cloud rose from the direction of the ammunition dump like an atomic explosion. The German soldiers who'd been pursuing them were gone, killed, wounded, or fleeing in terror. "Move," Fairfax croaked, his voice barely audible through the ringing in his ears. "Before they regroup." They reached extraction point Bravo 3 hours later, a collapsed barn on the outskirts of an abandoned village that had been depopulated during the occupation. Every step was agony. Fairfax's ears still rang from the explosion, his body was covered in cuts and bruises, and his uniform was torn and filthy. Beside him, Mackay limped from a shrapnel wound to his leg, his face gray with pain but his eyes still sharp and alert. Lieutenant Sarah Covington emerged from the shadows of the barn, relief flooding her features. "Christ, I thought you were dead." The explosion. Everyone in Beauvais saw it. "The Germans are going absolutely mad with security sweeps." "Good," Fairfax said, collapsing against the barn wall. "Let them waste resources on sweeps while we hit the final targets." Covington handed him a canteen of water and a coded message from London. Fairfax read it twice, his exhausted mind processing the words slowly. "Operation Severed Vein, 7 targets confirmed destroyed. German supply networks in northern France significantly disrupted. Wehrmacht Logistics Command reports critical shortages. Recommend completion of remaining objectives if feasible. Extraction authorized after Target 9. Utmost importance, avoid capture. Good luck. Godspeed." 7 down. 2 remaining. The next 72 hours became a blur of movement, planning, and controlled violence. Target 8 was a fuel storage facility outside Calais, the very location the Germans had fortified, expecting Fairfax's team to strike days earlier. By the time they actually hit it, German security had relaxed slightly, convinced the saboteurs had moved to a different region. Fairfax and Mackay infiltrated through a drainage culvert, planted incendiary charges among the fuel tanks, and withdrew before the facility erupted into an inferno that burned for 2 days straight. 8 down. 1 remaining. Target 9 was the most dangerous of all, a Wehrmacht ammunition train scheduled to depart from the Arras railway depot at dawn on December 1, 1943, carrying supplies directly to German defensive positions along the anticipated invasion beaches. Intelligence suggested this train was part of a major logistics push to stockpile materials before winter weather made supply operations more difficult. Fairfax planned to derail it in a narrow mountain pass where recovery operations would be nearly impossible. But by now, the Germans knew someone was specifically targeting their supply infrastructure. Security around military trains had intensified dramatically. Guard details had tripled. Random inspections were constant. Even approaching a train station without proper documentation meant immediate arrest and interrogation. "This is different from the others," Mackay observed as they studied the train's route from a hilltop overlooking the tracks. "The ammunition dump we attacked from inside. The junction we infiltrated with forged papers. But this? We're back to old-fashioned sabotage, sneaking up to railway tracks and planting explosives. That's when things tend to go wrong." Fairfax nodded. "Which is why we're not planting explosives on the tracks. We're planting them on the train itself." He outlined the plan. They would board the ammunition train at a rural water stop 20 miles outside Arras, hide charges in several ammunition cars, set delayed timers, and disembark before the train reached the mountain pass. When the explosives detonated, the resulting secondary explosions from the train's cargo would create a disaster far beyond what simple track demolition could achieve. "You realize this is suicide," Covington said bluntly. "Boarding a moving German military train, planting explosives while surrounded by Wehrmacht guards, then escaping before detonation? The margin for error is non-existent." "The margin for error has been non-existent since Target 1, Fairfax replied. "We're still here." But his words carried a weight they hadn't before. He was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. The constant danger, the endless calculations, the weight of dead comrades whose sacrifices had made Operation Severed Vein possible, it was crushing him slowly. Sometimes, in the brief moments before sleep claimed him, Fairfax wondered if he'd survive to see the liberation of France, or if his name would simply become another classified casualty in the files of the Special Operations Executive. December 1, 1943. 0530 hours. The ammunition train approached the rural water stop, its locomotive puffing steam into the freezing pre-dawn darkness. Fairfax and Mackay waited in the shadows beside the tracks, wearing stolen railway worker clothing and carrying satchels filled with plastic explosives and timing devices. The train slowed to take on water. Guards patrolled the platform, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Fairfax counted 12 soldiers visible, probably twice that many inside the cars and the locomotive. "Now," Fairfax whispered. They moved from the shadows and climbed aboard separate ammunition cars, using the noise of the water pumps and the hiss of steam to mask their movement. Inside the car, Fairfax worked by feel in near-total darkness, his hands finding the wooden ammunition crates and slipping explosive charges between them. His fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon, connecting wires, setting timers, ensuring the detonators were hidden where casual inspection wouldn't reveal them. 45 seconds. 60. 90. A flashlight beam swept across the interior of the car. "You there? What are you doing?" Fairfax froze. A German guard stood in the doorway, rifle raised, suspicion clear in his voice. There was no innocent explanation. No clever lie that would work. The explosives were visible in Fairfax's hands. Time slowed to a crawl. Fairfax saw the guard's finger tightening on the trigger, saw the recognition dawning in the German's eyes, saw his own death approaching. Then Mackay appeared behind the guard like a ghost, his combat knife flashing once in the darkness. The guard collapsed without a sound. Mackay dragged the body into the shadows. "Time is set. We need to go. Now." They leaped from the moving train as it began accelerating away from the water stop, hitting the ground hard and rolling into the underbrush beside the tracks. Behind them, the ammunition train disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying its deadly cargo and hidden explosives toward the mountain pass. 90 minutes later, the charges detonated. The explosion was visible from 30 miles away, a pillar of fire and smoke that rose from the mountain pass like a beacon. The ammunition train's cargo, thousands of artillery shells, crates of rifle ammunition, boxes of grenades, detonated in a chain reaction that continued for hours. The mountain pass became impassable, blocked by twisted wreckage and unstable terrain. German supply operations through that route would be impossible for months. Target 9, accomplished. Operation Severed Vein, complete. 5 days later, under cover of darkness, a Royal Navy motor torpedo boat extracted Fairfax, Mackay, and Covington from a beach near Dieppe. As the French coastline disappeared behind them and the white cliffs of Dover appeared ahead, Fairfax allowed himself to feel something he hadn't permitted in weeks: relief. They'd done it. 9 targets. 14 days. An impossible mission completed against impossible odds. In London, the Special Operations Executive debriefed them in that same basement room where Operation Severed Vein had begun. The senior officer who'd recruited Fairfax studied the mission reports with something approaching awe. "The impact assessment from Signals Intelligence is extraordinary," he said. "Wehrmacht logistics networks across northern France have been devastated. Supply routes that were moving thousands of tons of material weekly are now operating at reduced capacity or completely offline. German commanders are reporting critical shortages that will take months to resolve. When the invasion comes, their defensive preparations will be significantly hampered because of your actions." But Fairfax barely heard the praise. He was thinking about Lieutenant David Pearson, shot dead in ruin. Corporal James Fletcher, captured and likely executed. Private Michael Stevens, killed by a landmine. The French resistance fighters who'd provided intelligence and support, many of whom were probably already arrested or killed by the Gestapo's brutal reprisals. Was it worth it? Mackay asked quietly later that evening as they sat in a London pub, trying to pretend they were normal soldiers on normal leave. "All those people dead. Us nearly dead a dozen times. Was it worth it?" Fairfax thought about the Allied soldiers who would storm the beaches of Normandy 7 months later. Soldiers who would face Wehrmacht divisions undersupplied and under-equipped because 9 critical supply lines had been severed by a British engineer and his explosive plan. Soldiers who would survive battles they might otherwise have lost, because German tanks ran out of fuel or German artillery ran out of shells or German reinforcements arrived too late to matter. "Yes," Fairfax said finally. "It was worth it." The liberation of France came on June 6, 1944. By then, Captain William Fairfax was back in England, training another team of engineers for another impossible mission. But sometimes, when he heard reports of Allied advances through France, he allowed himself a small smile. Because he knew, even if the history books would never record it, even if the classified files would stay sealed for decades, that somewhere in the chaos of war, a handful of men with explosives and courage had struck a blow that mattered. Operation Severed Vein remained classified until 1973. When the files were finally released, military historians recognized it as one of the most successful sabotage campaigns of World War II, a masterclass in strategic disruption executed with surgical precision and extraordinary bravery. Captain William Fairfax received the Distinguished Service Order posthumously in 1975, having died peacefully in 1968, never having spoken publicly about his wartime service. But the impact of those 14 days in November and December 1943 lived on, a testament to the truth that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in railway junctions, on bridges, in ammunition dumps, and in the hearts of men willing to risk everything to light a spark in the darkness. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next video.